All right, so in the stream, we're covering what is the DBQ, how do you do the DBQ, what are easy ways to get points on the DBQ, what do you not want to do on the DBQ, and we're going to look over past DBQs in the end. So what is the DBQ? The DBQ is where you develop, this is from the College Board, where you develop an argument based on historical evidence, and you'll be given documents from 1600 to 2001, and so there will be more recent ones. They will, even let's say your topics from, let's say, like the topic is like, from 1600. You could have a document from like 1997 because it's like some secondary resource. It's like some analysis of some event that occurred. And so you like the time range, it really doesn't matter. It's not something you have to be worried about, but just know like they'll be from any time. So it's not like something you need to prepare for, like, from documents this time to this time. Like when I did Euro last year, I never prepared for that, but you could bring into account like, this resources from this time period. So you can do that too. In the thing. So you have to, in the actual, when you're actually writing your DBQ, you have to look for the title, the author, the time. But beforehand, you don't need to prepare anything about that. This is worth 25% of your exam score. I'm not sure how much it is for your US history, but I'd expect it to be about the same. And then for this, you'll get 60 minutes to write it, and they recommend a 15-minute reading time. And when I did Euro last year, I did use every DBQ I did use the 15-minute reading time. It's not, you don't have to, and it's not, you're not forced to, but it's there just, it's like an extra reminder that, for 15 minutes that for you to do your reading. And so the point breakdown is if thesis/claim is 1 point, or you can get up to 1 point. You can get up to 1 point for context. You can get up to 3 points for your evidence and up to 2 points for your analysis and reasoning. So what do you put in your thesis? So we're going to start off with the thesis. It's going to go in the beginning paragraph. So generally, depending on what you have to write about, I would recommend 4 to 5 paragraphs. So let's say you have to bring up 3 points, then I would do 5 paragraphs. You have your intro paragraph in which you put your contextualization and your thesis. Then you have your 3 main points, and then you have your conclusion. And then if you don't, and if it's something like, more of a compare of contrast, more than where you would need 3 points, then I would recommend, your intro paragraph, your compare paragraph, your contrast paragraph, and then your conclusion. And so your thesis should respond to the prompt, and you can historically defend it. That's the most important part. So if you just put any thesis that you can't historically defend, we'll look at some that are and some that aren't later. Otherwise you won't get this point. And so you have to respond to the prompt. You can't just rephrase or restate it. And so you should give reasons why. So, and it has to have a because. It has to give an explanation to it. And so what I also recommend, and what I put in the slides here, is that you should underline it or write on the margins like T or thesis. And so that will alert them, because these people are only given, I think, 6 minutes to read or 6 to 3, I can't remember, 3 minutes, let's say it's 3 minutes, to read your entire DBQ. And so in that time, they're just going to go check, do they have all these things? Because you're basically writing for points. You're not writing for anything, special or specific. You're writing for points, and that's what it is here. And so it's more, you have to have the filler in betweens. You can't just write thesis, contextualization, otherwise you won't get any points. It's not like, you have to really care about, your grammar that much, or, are using enough, I don't know what you guys, what a good example here, but they're not caring about your grammar really, or your spelling really, as long as they can understand it. And so your goal is to make it as easy it is for them to read it. So contextualization, you're going to be talking about the context of this point. So if you're talking about let's say World War I, right? You could talk about you can talk about how secret alliances, and you can talk about events leading up to World War I, depending on it's what happened before, what happened after, but mostly before, or what's surrounding this, what could help So if someone who doesn't understand like this concept at all, like, if you tell them a little bit before, a little bit after, like a little bit of like a little bit of between of what happened, it would give them, they would somewhat understand it. And then that's what contextualization is. So contextualization would go first, if I remember this correctly. You put your contextualization first, that's what I recommend, and then have your thesis, and that's it for your intro paragraph. You can't just, it has to be more than a few sentences. It can't just be one sentence. So now we go to evidence. And so evidence from the documents is 1 point. So you can get 1 point. I think it adds up to 3, unless I'm being very forgetful here. No, it's just 1 point. So you can get 1 point only if you use 3 documents, right? If you just use the content. So if you just even describe it, you can get this 1 point. So let's say this: you don't know anything at all, right? You just read the prompt, and you mind blank. You can't remember a thing. So let's say like evaluate the extent generally in your thesis, like in the prompt, and they'll give you they'll give you your 7 documents. So in those 7 documents, you can kind of build somewhat of an understanding what your thing is about, because the documents are relating to what your prompt is. So you could let's say just write a thesis that's about the prompt. If you talk about the context, that's already 2 points. If you just mention 3 of the documents, that's already 3 points. So if you completely mind blank, you're still like insured 3 points at least. But then you can work towards more. So if you want to get 2 points in the evidence section, instead you should talk about 6 documents, and you have to cite the document. So just around you talk about a document, and then in parentheses write doc 1, doc 2, doc 3. You can underline this if you want. You can also put on the margins, and you should if you just don't talk about it, and to get the second point also, you have to actually support your argument. You have to say, because you're not going to be writing, oh, this doesn't support my argument. You're going to only talk about this supports your argument. Otherwise, you're going to have to change your argument here. That's how it works. This is you don't need counter rebuttals or anything. Yeah. If I'm going too fast, please just tell me. All right. So we're going to continue talking about evidence. You get 1 more point for using, this is chalk in the 2 points. You get 1 more point if you use evidence beyond the document. So this is evidence that you know. So this can't even be, this cannot be different. This has to be different than contextualization. You cannot double dip, meaning you cannot bring up something in your contextualization and then bring up that exact same point in the evidence beyond the document. Or let's say you use, we'll talk about this later, but let's say, actually I'll just bring it up later, not to confuse you guys. And then it has to be something it has to be actual evidence from anything outside of, the documents and what you use in contextualization. It could be anything. You could bring, I don't know, if you're talking about World War I propaganda, you could bring in Walt Disney and how they were hired to make some propaganda. No, that would marginally work. But if you talk about how the U.S. prioritized, if it talks about World War I and it talks about how the U.S. liked propaganda and used it, you can break up it, as long as it's not in the documents or used in contextualization. You can bring up how the government hired Walt Disney to make propaganda for the United States. You could bring up things like that, or how they hired him to make a movie training new recruits. If it was kind of like a propaganda film that was, but basically, if it's something outside of the documents and what you use in your contextualization, right, you just need to bring it up. You just need to bring 1 point, 1 piece of evidence from any of that, and if you put it in somewhere in your evidence, that's good. That's all you need for the evidence beyond the document point. Yeah. That's mostly that. So if we go back to our 3, 4, 5 paragraph breakdown, because you would aim for 6 or you would aim for 7 documents. So what I would recommend is, let's say you're doing two body paragraphs. You do 4 documents in one, you do 3 documents in the other, and then in that other, put evidence beyond the documents. Or you could even do 5 and 2. I wouldn't really recommend it, and then it's not a good idea at all to put 6 in 1. The reason you would put 7 even though it only requires 6 is, let's say a reader misses one, or they think, oh, what they brought up here really doesn't fit. Like, they're actually not like, supporting their argument with it. They're just restating it, and they won't count it. Then you can still get 6 and get the other point. All right, so for analysis / reasoning, right, there's 2 points. So 1 point you get is from sourcing. So that's from at least 3 of your documents. You have to explain how or why the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, or why the audience is relevant. And so you have to explain rather just like, oh, the POV is this guy's pro this because yada, 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 right? For example, like it might be, this document might not be credible because it's a political speech, or this diary or personal is credible because it's from so and so, and it was written in this time period. And so, they're feeling, at this time, they're feeling this, like yada, yada, yada. So it's more of like, sourcing's more about, it's not really just restating. You have to, like go into it a bit more and like explain why, this helps. And then same thing here, I would recommend to do more than 3 because, if you get one wrong or like they don't say, oh, you're just restating it here. We're not like, I really don't think if like a reader thinks like, oh, you're just restating it here. You're not like actually like going into it, explaining it, and they don't count it. Then let's say you only did 3, then that becomes 2, and you just lost a point. For your complexity point, it demonstrates, you really understand the the development of this prompt, and so you can use evidence from that, according to them, corroborates, qualifies, and modifies an argument that addresses the question. So you literally are just finding a similar difference. You can evaluate both sides, multiple causes, effects, and whatever you talk about in complexity, it cannot be what you said in your context, your evidence, or your outside point. So you can't double dip on pieces of evidence, to get multiple points. So let's go over the structure. Like I said, we're going to intro with contextualization and thesis. Thesis should have an X and Y. Paragraph X corresponds with X and thesis. Paragraph Y corresponds with Y and thesis. And then conclusion restates thesis. And then maybe add Z, like an extra point you didn't mention before, to get that complexity point. And that's basically it. And then Z, because the complexity point really shouldn't be, in the thesis. So final notes. Make sure you know scoring notes. So, like you read past, like we're going to do this later on, look at past DBQs, especially LEQs and SAQs. This applies to everything. Not as much SAQs, but still LEQs and DBQs. Look at the scoring notes. See how they graded it, because those are public for like a reason. Make sure your thesis has good line of reasoning. Your contextualization is specific, so you can't be, you can't be broad. And you can't double dip on points. So use contextualization that shouldn't be used as outside info. So like, what you use for contextualization couldn't use outside info, shouldn't be used for complexity, same thing. Question? How much would be too much contextualization? I mean, a few sentences would be all right. When we go over the specifics, I can show you when it would be too much. The context and the contextualization, yeah, go over that again. But too much would be maybe if you do, let's say, 3 to 2 sentences might be too little. 3 to 4 sentences is just right, and then anything over 5 is too much, depending on your topic. Let's say your topic is something really complex, and you aren't able to explain everything. You don't need to explain everything. You just need to explain main things that happened around, so a little bit before, during, and after. So going over the event in like a 4 to 5 sentence summary, 3 to 4 sentence summary. That would be a good amount. That's basically what you're doing. Too much would be, yeah, if you're doing 5 or more, or going really, really specific. You're talking about individual, but talking about individual battles that weren't key battles or turning points. If you don't those you can bring up just fine. But if you bring up really specific battles that don't really add to it, oh, this was like a fourth victory for this like thing, and then this was a fifth. There's not really a need to bring them up. So it's like you want to be specific, but you don't want to be too specific. Is that? Can you go over context in the intro? Yeah. So the contextualization is, yeah, you're basically just going, talking about events that happened before and after, and it can't just be like in a phrase or a reference. It should be a few sentences. Yeah. All right. So this is through FRQ. Here's our FRQ. This is part 1 or 2. This is the SAQs. That. Here's our DBQ. And so the DBQ is going to be matched with the LEQ. And so you're going to be given 1 hour 40 minutes to do your DBQ and your LEQ. They suggest to do 1 hour for your DBQ and then 40 minutes for your LEQ. But let's say this, your LEQ is super easy. You finish it in 30 minutes. Now you've got 1 hour 10 minutes to do your DBQ. Or like the other way around. You finish your like DBQ in 40 minutes. Then you've got an hour to do your LEQ. And so that's like one of the nicer things, unless you take too long on both and you run out of time fully. So the 2018 DBQ was evaluate whether the 30 years war was fought primarily for religious or for political reasons. And so they gave us our 7 documents here. So immediately what I would do, I mean, I didn't write this DBQ, I wrote last year's, but I would write, I'd read these, see what the main points are. I would see, is this for or is this against it? And then I would write it on the side, and I'd bring up, I'd write, all right, what's 2 things they mention here? All right, what's 2 things they mention here that I could use as evidence? 2 things, and go, etc., until I finish. And so with that, right, then I know, okay, I know 7 documents, right? I know whether they're for or against, and I know exactly, all right, let's say this. 1 is completely against my thing, right? And the other 6 are. Right, so in this case, I would most likely use the 6, right, instead of going for 7. And in that, what I would do is, right, so now I go through, I have my 2 things for each, and I find, all right, which pieces of evidence can I pull? Right, can I talk about? So in here, we're talking about like the Huguenots and elimination of rebellion, etc. Here we're talking about, here's a letter from the King of Sweden to the Protestant, Dr. Brandenburg. And so once I get my pieces of evidence, I would, I'd get my contextualization, which would be about, was the 30 Years' War fought for primarily or for religious? If you really want to get your complexity, you could say like, while many believe, not all many believe, but or you could say, while many believe the 30 Years' War was fought primarily for religious reasons, or like fought primarily for political reasons, in fact, it was actually for religious reasons. That's what you could do, and then if you expand on that later on, that's what you could do to get your complexity point. So that's like a good way to do it. And so, yeah. And then let me open up. Let me open up the is it the sample responses to the DBQ. Go. And we can go over what they recommended, because if I bring up what I say, right, and then they because how they score the DBQ is like, check, and then they'll give their explanation to why they said that here. So do you guys want me to go over the documents more in point, or like, go through each document, see what it says? Or do you want to just continue at the scoring guidelines? Up to you guys. The documents in point. All right. So document 1, which was the letter, is the letter. It talks about it's a letter from Emperor Matthias to the Bohemian Protestants, And so this it's talking about, in this letter, he talks about how he has no plans to rescind or get rid of the free exercise of religion, and so there's no need for Bohemia to join the war. And so with POV, with the POV point, so the sourcing point, you can talk about how the emperor wants to reassure Protestants that he doesn't want rebellion, and you can say that Protestants didn't want Catholicism to be imposed in Bohemia. Document 2, it's the Constitution of the Bohemian Federation. So in this point, it talks about how they need to defend, how the cities need to defend Calvinism as the motivation for creating the Confederation. And so PUV, you can talk about how Bohemian leaders are justifying their actions for taking defensive measures and why they want to protect the free exercise of Calvinism. Next up, we have a report to the elector. And so it talks about problems of reimposing Catholicism like in areas of Bavaria. And so the POV you can talk about here is like the Habsburgs are winning against Protestant German states, and they're reopposing Catholicism, and Jesuits seek to reassure the elector that even though this Protestant resistance to Catholicism is winning, keep in mind that Jesuits were people who wanted to convert people to Catholicism. All right, so next you have a letter from to the elector of Brandenburg, and you can say the letter is talking about how the Swedish intervention is necessary to prevent the Habsburgs from wiping out Protestantism. And so it seeks to, you can say POV wise, you can talk about how the Protestant king wants to support Protestant princes in Germany, or seeks to, intimidate the elector into supporting the Swedes, for the purpose. Next, you have meeting notes, and you can say the purpose of this, if the meeting was to look like, Sweden wants to secure the safety of sea, with all this happening, it justifies Adolphus's land acquisition, and it's a confidential meeting between allied government, and it shows political power. Next, you have that Richelieu engraving, and it portrays the cardinal protecting France from Huguenots and rival Catholic powers, and it tries to influence public opinion to the wisdom of Richelieu's policies. And it talks about how France and POV, that's where you could say POV, or France is intervening in behalf of the Protestants to weaken the Habsburgs. And the last one is Pope Innocent X declaration. And it criticizes the Peace of Westphalia and claims it's not legit. And then POV wise, you can sees the settlement as a defeat for Catholics, and chastises the Catholic rulers for putting secular interests ahead of faith. So that's all what each document talks about. That was a lot. No, if it's too much, if I'm going to feel too fast, remember, just tell me in the chat. All right, so if we look at the scoring notes, you can see the scoring notes. You can either get 0 or 1 points, right? And so here, acceptable theses are, while the 30 Years' War was religious, it was fought to protect the freedom of religion, but it was also political and used strategically, right? You also have 30 Years' War was fought overwhelmingly for religious reasons, but with countries being divided to protect the sanctity of one religion or the other. What was divided Catholics and Protestants, and it was mostly fought of religion and stemmed over a little squad in Bohemia. Over. I accidentally pressed that button. Let me fix it. All right. No, click your hide. Fix this. All right. So that's what you talk about thesis. Unacceptable theses are mostly fought primarily, but was fought political, but primarily religious. It's not just restating a point. You have to argue what you're going to talk about in your thesis. It's primarily Plot for primarily religious and secondarily plot for political, and it's hard to determine, it's not really a thesis. You can't, it's not specific. Then you have your contextualization, it's talking about, prior, how he spread his Protestant ideas, and that, as a result, the European states were divided. These are just talking about events that happened before. The Peace of Augsburg was taken away. Unacceptable, something not specific. Or, it's not let's see, although it was primarily the Huguenots who caused many involved. It's not, there's not a clear link to motivations of the war. It's not talking about what we want. And then here are examples of what you could talk about here. Evidence. And there's just, specific evidences. So they gave 2 examples. These lists aren't exact, so you can go more beyond. This is your document context supporting a document. So document 1, the Holy Roman Emperor attempted to convince others that he wasn't motivated to start a war. However, this is untrue because he's Catholic. That's evidence you can talk about. Evidence beyond the documents, you could just talk about any of the POVs I said earlier. That's this, analysis and reasoning. Got them mixed up. This is, your own evidence. So, when messengers arrived bearing news that the emperor lied, townspeople responded by throwing the messengers out the window in the defenestration of Prague. Or, Richelieu was primarily convincing King Louis to enter the war as it could extend French power. Those are 2 examples because they weren't in the documents, and you learned about them. POVs, you could talk about anything from before. And then your complexity, so you can talk about both. There were both motivations. You can talk about here they had nuance, so you can how the response acknowledges that Richelieu, I can't even say his name, in document 6 is achieving political gains is using religious as excuse. And you can go more and more, how he's talking about he's killing 2 birds with 1 stone by removing Huguenots and increasing unity. So that's nuance. Multiple causes. You can talk about how both political, that there's both, but there's a demarcation between them. So document 1, document 2. You can talk about how there's multiple motivations by analyzing 2 countries' aims. You have collaboration, which is establishes the argument that's the true purpose of the 30 Years' War. It's the true purpose though was to gain power. You're talking about how Cardinal Richelieu, how he wanted political gains using religious as an excuse, or you can connect it to something newer, the Spanish Inquisition. So this is an example DBQ, or an example. Can I scroll? Can I scroll, please? Oh, okay, here we go. So this is an example DBQ. This is someone who wrote the actual DBQ, and so So here we have your context. You have your thesis. Your body paragraphs. Let's go. And then you have your conclusions. So something I'd recommend is if you go into College Board's website, they have all these answers online. And so what I would do is just look at the example writing, right, and then score it yourself, right? Looking at the scoring guidelines from above, score it yourself. This would give you an example. This would help you out. This really helped me out, understanding more of the DBQ, how it's scored and all that. Score it yourself, see what you would think, and then if you scroll down more, the College Board writes exactly how much they got and the reasons why. So this is number B. So there's always 3. So there's always A, B, and C. And so for A, right, they got a 7 because they got their thesis point stating the 30 Years' War began with local disputes in religion, but it was primarily political later on. Then they earned contextualization by successfully situating the war, geographically and chronologically. Then it got 2 points for evidence using at least 6 of the documents. It earned the 1 POV point or the 1 evidence beyond point when it talked about like the French goal in the 30 Years' War in document 6 to diminish the power of Spanish Netherlands, and just dispute control of the Habsburgs. And then sourcing point for 1, 2, and 5, and then complexity point when they use nuanced argument. Then they talk about how B only got 1. 4, I'm not going to go into it, and C only got 1 if you want to go over these later on. So that's everything we have. I'll link the College Board website where you guys can see past exam questions. And then after this is just Q&A. So we've got some time. How do you study for the AP Euro test as a whole? So you have to remember that the AP Euro exam is more, especially the DBQs, LEQ, it's more like the SAQs generally won't be on something like small. They'll be on something major. The multiple choice, you should know it's going to be stimulus based. So you should know what you're they'll talk about it before, but you should know mostly the big event, most of the big events, like skimming, like night before, like the AP exam. Oops. They were on my computer. I skimmed over the entire book, like with a friend, going over, summarizing each and every unit. No, I did it for the 2 nights before, because doing it in 1 night would be too much, or 3 nights, and then the night before I went to sleep early. And so, yeah, how do you study for the AP Euro whole? So for stimulus based, you really need to know main points, really, or how things carried over. So how main points, how causations, how things relate to each other. That's mostly what you need to know for in general. Knowing about main points would be good for the LEQ, LEQ, and SAQ. And then DBQ, really, there's nothing to study for because you're going to be as long as you know main points, really, how things related, keep saying the same thing, because that's really what they're testing you on. Because any specific stuff would be not really something you've probably never heard of unless you forgot something, or so the only reason you would need to know specific events would be for the DBQ, outside evidence, outside from the documents point, the LEQ, because they're not going to give you any info from that, or the SEQ. In the same thing, in the multiple choice, right? You just need to know big things that happen, because most of the specific things they're going to be relating to the stimulus that they talked about beforehand. So really, I just keep restating this because that's how it was. That's how it is. It's mostly main points, main events, and how things relate to each other. Another question. What are some ways to organize your DBQ? So how I did this, this is what I did for all my practice DBQs also. I started with my contextualization, and I ended my intro paragraph with my thesis. And then let's say the thesis more is more of a compare and contrast. Then I would do, in your thesis, I would include 2 points, right? Or 2 things, X and Y. And so then after my next paragraph, my first body paragraph would talk about X. My second body paragraph would talk about Y. And then in there, I would try to do three pieces of evidence in X, 3 pieces of evidence in Y. And then, put my outside evidence wherever I could, where it fit. And then in the conclusion, I would put my complexity. And so after each piece, after each, I talked about each, where I brought up each piece of evidence, that's where I include the POV, the sourcing info, so I could get that point too. So the complexity point is the sixth point, or the seventh point technically you can get. It's worth, well, yeah, it's 1 point. It's part of the analysis and reasoning. And so according to College Board, this is what they say. It demonstrates a complex understanding of historical development that's the focus of a prompt. So you use evidence to quote unquote, corroborate, qualify, and modify an argument. Basically what they're saying is you do something more with it later on. So you can talk like you can say, for example, we were looking at the when we were looking at the 2018 DBQ. You can talk about how while it was fought for you can say how it was fought for religious while it may seem it was fought for religious reasons, in fact it was fought for political reasons. That's something you could do and then if you expand on that later, that's something you can do to get your complexity point. It's also called the demonstrating complex understanding point. You can talk about how connections between that and something newer or something older. You can talk about how you can explain like the nuance of an issue. Like how a ruler can use both the motivations religious and political to achieve the goal of increasing power. There were multiple causes. That's examples of ways to get your complexity point. All right, so I'll be here for the next 5 to 10 minutes answering questions in the chat. The next Euro stream is actually tonight. And yeah, we've got one more. How many paragraphs? So I suggest 4 to 5, depending on the point on the prompt. So it was something where it'd be more kind of, you could say, compare and contrast, or like where you'd only bring up 2 things, right? Two things to your thesis, like 2 pieces of evidence, or like 2 reasons why in your evidence. And before, you need your intro and conclusion, the 2 body. If you bring up 3 things, like 3 different things in your thesis, like from the prompt, then it would be 5 paragraphs. But I really wouldn't do 2 paragraphs, or I wouldn't do 3 paragraphs, and I wouldn't do 6. Yeah. So in that case, I'll end the stream here. I'll answer questions in chat, and then the replay should be available within the next 24 hours. And then, yeah, and the slides will be linked to that. All right, see you guys.